Hello, and welcome to the Mill Valley Historical Society's first Wednesday speaker presentation, an event we host on the first Wednesday of every month. My name is Deborah Schwartz, and I'm a mountain guide, oral historian, and director of the first Wednesday speaker series. Tonight's presentation is titled Lost Islands of San Francisco Bay, with one of my favorite historians, Brian Crawford. Also with us tonight is Mill Valley history librarian, Natalie Snoyman. You can't see her, but she's making sure everything goes well in this Zoom format. Thank you, Natalie. And thanks also to the Mill Valley Public Library for allowing us to host our speaker series in this safe and accessible format. Before we begin, I want to say to those of you in the audience who are already members of the Mill Valley Historical Society, thank you for your generosity and interest. Your membership allows us to continue our efforts to infuse history into the present through speaker presentations, oral interviews, history walks, history plaques, and the collaboration to restore and return to Mill Valley Engine Number 9, the last remaining locomotive from the Mount Tamalpais Scenic Railroad. For those of you who are not yet members, please join us. Membership ensures that you will be alerted to future talks such as tonight's, and you'll be alerted to our annual Walk into History that takes place on Memorial Day weekend. You'll receive Chuck Olenberg's charming Mill Valley history vignettes via email, and you will be updated about other historical events in our town and nearby. Membership to our organization is so affordable and just a click away on the Mill Valley Historical Society website. For practical purposes, the audience must be muted for this webinar, but functional tools are located at the bottom of your screen to help us communicate with each other. If you can't see them now, just hover your cursor over the area and they should appear. Now look for the chat icon. The chat tool allows you to post comments, say hello to friends, and we encourage you to add information that you may have during this presentation. The Q&A option is where you can post questions you may have about tonight's presentation, and I'll address those questions to Brian after his talk. But if you have comments or personal stories to share, the chat room is the best place for that. Tonight's talk will last about 50 minutes, and after we'll take time for questions and comments from the audience. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Mill Valley Historical Society website in about 3 or 4 days. Just go to the website, click Events, select First Wednesday Lecture Series, and you'll find tonight's recording as well as many others. The San Francisco Bay we know today formed approximately 10,000 years ago. It covers over 1,600 square miles. It is the only outlet in the world that flows through a 1-mile narrow with hills on both sides, like columns or a gate. It's the second largest estuary in the world and the largest in the Western Americas. However, it is much altered from its original form. For example, there are several islands in San Francisco Bay that none of us will ever see. Arch Rock, Shag Rock, and Agnes Island are just a few of these lost islands. From scenic vistas to tragic tales, each of these islands has a unique story to tell. While some were built over, most were considered hazardous to marine navigation and were blasted away in spectacular explosions. How fortunate we are to have Brian Crawford with us tonight. It is historians like Brian who, with their inquiring minds and yearning for truth, reveal essential stories from the past, which has helped us better understand our present. Brian Crawford is an author, historian, trail builder, and open space activist living in Marin County. And he's been a speaker with the First Wednesday Speaker Series several times. Born in Ohio in 1947, Brian attended Ohio State and Antioch College, but dropped out and went to Haight-Ashbury for the Summer of Love. Brian has 3 published novels, 3 collections of short stories, 3 memoirs of his adventures, and 9 books on Marin history. He's not only a treasured friend to me, he's a friend to our entire community. So please, won't you give a warm welcome to Brian Crawford. Hey, Brian.
Hi there. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for coming tonight.
Thanks for the glowing introduction.
You deserve it and more. So I'll hand it off to you.
All right. I am going to share my screen. For a historian interested in local Marin history, I have the best volunteer job in the world. Some years ago, the Antique Kent, California room at the Marin County Free Library purchased a large collection of tens of thousands of maps of Marin County. The maps had been collected by a long line of surveyors going back more than 170 years to the founding of the county. The collection was so large that they had to rent a warehouse on Los Camos Drive to contain it. A staff of dedicated volunteers and professional historians has been cataloging and conserving this collection ever since. There are other collections there, as well as the maps, including a wonderful collection of paintings and photographs of early Marin. When I learned of this collection, I volunteered to help curate it, and for the last 8 years, I have spent my Thursday afternoons there. I was assigned what to me was the best task: to catalog the old maps so we knew exactly what we had and how to lay hands on it. We had no idea what the collection contained or even how many maps there were. I would slide open a dusty old wooden drawer or pull open a tube and extract a map that no one has looked at in well over a century. I would research and describe what it showed. The oldest and most fragile were digitized and placed in protective plastic sleeves. The collection is invaluable for researchers. About 5 years ago, I pulled out a map titled only A118A, Tidelands map number 8. It showed the shoreline of San Rafael Bay from Point San Pedro to Point San Quentin, with San Rafael Canal cutting diagonally across it. So it was easy to locate where it was. San Rafael Bay is shown covered with a grid of lot lines, almost 2 square miles of submarine real estate. There was no indication as to who drew the map or when, but other clues indicated it was made between about 1870 and 1910. I started recording the notable features: the canal, and of course the Marin Islands, East, West, and South Island. I have sailed and kayaked that bay for 30 years. I know for a fact there is no such thing as South Marin Island. Yet there it was, clearly marked and labeled. I stared at it in disbelief. Maps certainly can and do contain errors, but this was no slip of the pen. Looking closely, I could see that there were survey points on the island. Someone had actually landed on it and measured 5 corners of the little islet. Clearly, a third island had existed there at one time. I was thrilled. Like Columbus, I had discovered a new land. The Google search for South Marin Island turned up some old references to it, saying it was also known as San Rafael Rock and Murphy's Rock. Murphy probably refers to Don Timoteo Murphy, the first Anglo resident of San Rafael, but I can find nothing else about either name. But what happened to the island? My online research was stymied. I looked up in frustration and my eyes fell on Hiram Austin's magnificent 1873 map of Marin County hanging on the wall opposite. I went up close, and sure enough, there was the island. All of us in the annex had studied that map many times, but none of us had noticed it. Of course, it's tiny and easy to miss unless you're looking for it. I moved to the map right next to it, George Dodge's 1892 map of Moran, and another map with which I was very familiar. There's no South Marin Island labeled. At first, I thought it was missing, but then I looked very closely, and I found this line of X's marking the edge of the rancho, the border of the rancho, and in the middle of it is a little O, like the X's and O's on a love letter. I believe that little O is South Marin Island. Longtime Marin surveyor Ed Newt was able to provide an aerial photograph from 1952, which showed the island. Also prominent is the streaming outfall from the sewage treatment plant in the days before the EPA. I was astounded that I had studied all these maps and images and never noticed the tiny island. Shaking my head in wonder, I glanced at the next item on the wall, an arm's length away from where I had worked for years. It was a huge blown-up aerial photograph of Moran from 1954. There was the island, clear as day, right where the old map said it should be. This may well be the last photo of the island ever taken, for it clarifies its fate. Two long dikes had been built out to the island, one stretching off to the southeast to the Marin Rod and Gun Club on Point San Quentin, the other running southwest toward Kerner Boulevard. The dikes enclosed a large area of marsh and shallow water, which was later filled and developed. The island is just outside the corner of this reclaimed land. In the photograph, the enclosed polder is still being drained, so the dikes were still under construction in 1954. So where's the island today? I overlaid the old map onto Google Earth to confirm my analysis, and it matched up perfectly. South Marin Island was still there, incorporated into the dikes. A third dike has now been added, running east from the island and curling around to the north to Pickleweed Park. The series of dikes is now called the Shoreline Trail, part of the San Francisco Bay Trail. No wonder I had never seen the island. I try to avoid dikes when I'm sailing. In 1978, the 34 acres around the former island were donated to the Marin Audubon Society, and it is now their little-known Murphy's Rock Preserve. It's still possible to visit South Marin Island. Start at the Target store and walk north on the San Francisco Bay Trail to its intersection with the Bay Shore Path. That junction was the southern tip of South Marin Island. There it is. It's rather a pretty spot with good views of the bay and the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. So I had rediscovered an island that formerly existed, but was no more. This find led me to research a number of other islands in the bay that no longer exist. Blossom Rock was never an island in historic times. When Royal Navy Commodore Frederick Beechey, captain of HMS Blossom, sailed into San Francisco Bay in 1827, he was returning from charting the Bering Sea, during which he had reached and named Point Barrow. On his return voyage, he visited the Mexican settlement of Yerba Buena. There were no English charts of the spectacular bay, so Beechey undertook a survey. In passing between Alcatraz and Yerba Buena Island, he discovered an obstruction 5 feet below the low tide line. At low tide, ripples and a strong overfall could be seen on the surface, but at other tides, there was no hint of the deadly obstruction. It lay 1,000 feet offshore, right in the channel for sailing to the mission and village of Yerba Buena. He sounded the area and found it to be a shelf of rock, roughly 100 by 150 feet in area. Beechey added it to his chart and named it Blossom Rock after his ship. He advised navigators to avoid the rock by taking a bearing on 2 immense redwoods on the ridge above Berkeley. They were known as the navigator trees and served seamen well until they were logged in 1851. In 1841, the gloriously named U.S. Navy commander Cadwallader Ringgold, as part of the Wilkes expedition that circled the world, did the first American survey of the bay, going as far up the river as Colusa. He noted Blossom Rock on the charts he published, which served as official guides for bay navigation for the next century. A buoy was placed on the rock to warn mariners, but ships continued to run into it. On December 27, 1850, the American ship Coriolanus, bound for Calcutta, went aground on the rock. Initial reports said that she had bilged, broken her bottom, but she was hauled off the following day and towed to a dry dock. She was so damaged she could not continue her voyage. Similar close calls happened to the Chilean bark Castander in 1853, the Peruvian bark Joseph Warren in 54, and the clipper ship Goddess in 1856. In 1861, the ship Aurora, loaded with wheat bound for Liverpool, was becalmed and drifted onto the rock before she could anchor. The same thing happened to the ship Sheet Anchor, bound for Australia in 63. As early as 1849, before the American takeover, newspapers called for the destruction of the rock. Quote, "It should be done at once, for already we have had marine disasters occurring either through fear or ignorance of this rock, sufficient to injure the reputation of much better harbors than the excellent harbor of San Francisco," unquote. It took 20 years, but in 1869, the Corps of Engineers surveyed the rock. They estimated that 10,000 tons of rock would have to be removed to clear it to a safe depth of 24 feet. They received only one bid, and the job was given to 47-year-old Latvian-born Alexei Valdemar von Schmidt. who had already built the Spring Valley water system and the massive dry docks at Hunters Point. Von Schmidt devised a very bold, risky, and original approach. He would bore a vertical shaft into the rock, hollow it out from the inside, and pack it full of explosives. Of course, no one had ever drilled a mine underwater, but von Schmidt was confident he could do it. He used surface blasting to blow off the highest point of the rock to make a level surface. Then he had a massive wooden frame constructed, 22 by 34 feet on the sides and 20 feet tall. In the center was a double-walled cofferdam, 8 by 8 feet. This framework was taken to the site on a specially built barge, and giant cranes lowered it into the water until it settled firmly on the rock. 6 massive anchors were attached to the sides to hold the framework in place. 16 pointed steel pilings were driven into the rock all around the framework to make it solidly immovable. Then sacks of clay were dumped into the spaces between the walls of the cofferdam, pushing the whole framework down onto the rock and forming a waterproof seal around the central area. The water was pumped out of the central cavity, and the framework was attached to the rock with concrete, forming a watertight workspace. The top of the framework extended 8 feet above sea level. Crews of carpenters decked over the framework. A tool shed was built on the deck, along with a cookhouse and lodgings for a crew of 16 men. Work crews stayed on the site for weeks, reducing the time and expense of transporting them from shore every day. A crew of miners began digging a vertical shaft into the rock. An iron cylinder, 6 feet in diameter, was lowered into the hole to reinforce it. All the workmen, their tools and equipment, and the materials had to pass down through this 6-foot tube, and all the rock they removed was lifted through it and dumped into the bay. It must have been a very claustrophobic place to work. By February 1870, they had reached the required depth of 41 feet and started several horizontal tunnels, 8 feet tall. The tunnels radiated out from the central shaft and ended when the engineers calculated that they were within 6 feet of the ocean. The one extending southeast toward Yerba Buena Island was 75 feet long. The walls between the tunnels were then removed, leaving only a few columns to support the rock above. Blossom Rock was now just a hollow shell. They brought in 39 English ale barrels, waterproofed with pitch inside and out. Each was filled with 530 pounds of blasting powder and sealed tight. For the center of the rock, 7 massive iron boilers had been constructed, each containing more than 1.5 tons of powder. Altogether, more than 23 tons of explosive were placed inside the rock, all connected to a single wire. In April, von Schmidt published notices warning vessels to avoid the area. Thousands of people lined the hills, docks, and rooftops to see the big explosion. But there were some last-minute delays, and the date was postponed 3 different times. Finally, on Saturday, April 23rd, 1870, everything was ready. The crowds gathered again. The engineers were on a barge a quarter mile from the rock. At 1:30, the Army battery at Fort Alcatraz fired a signal gun, and the whole Bay Area held its breath. Nothing happened. The wire to the barge had snapped. Von Schmidt and a few men rowed a small boat back to the rock, attached a spare wire, and rowed back towards the barge, unspooling the wire. But the tide and the weight of the wire kept them from reaching the barge, and when they were only 200 yards away, von Schmidt threw the switch. The Daily Alta California reported the result. The sight was terrifically grand. A large circular volume of water about 400 feet in diameter shot into the air to the height of about 100 feet, while in the center and amalgamated with the water could be seen black volumes of smoke and a sheet of stones, the latter ascending far above the water and presenting on the whole the appearance of a vast volcanic eruption. In the center of the vast column of a cone of water of smaller radius was shot up high into the air, higher than the surrounding water, and lending to the scene already magnificently sublime a feature no less admirable than attractive. The framework, too, was torn into shreds and thrown up with terrible force. The heavy volume of water returned immediately to its kindred element, leaving the air darkened with smoke. And after the lapse of some seconds, the stones and timbers came showering down with terrible fury. The water around the rock for a distance of nearly 1,000 feet changed its native greenish hue for a yellow, muddy, dirty color. Timbers floated in all directions, and the surface of the water seemed filled with the debris of the wreck. The work, well conceived, well planned, and well carried out, was brought to a successful termination. Blossom Rock, but a few minutes previously, the object of intense anxiety, was now completely annihilated, and it is a thing of the past. It took 8 more months to drag the shattered rubble off the shoal into deep water, but in December 1870, the Corps of Engineers determined that the entire surface now lay at least 24 feet below low water. Von Schmidt had fulfilled his contract and was eligible to receive his $75,000. He would make a profit of $30,000, about $682,000 today. San Francisco Bay is one of the newest geographic features in the country, no more than 10,000 years old. People have lived in the Bay Area for much longer than that. At that time, much of the world's water was frozen in glaciers and ice sheets. Sea level was 400 feet lower. The bay was a grassy valley with several high rocky hills covered in trees. A mighty river flowed through it, the ancestor of today's Sacramento, but many times larger. The river flowed out through the steep-walled canyon that would become the Golden Gate. It meandered across a wide, flat plain and emptied into the sea at a massive delta, now marked only by the rocky crags of the Farallones, 27 miles to the west. The valley that would become the bay would have been reminiscent of the Serengeti. And like the Serengeti, it was crisscrossed by a network of ancient migration trails cut deep into the turf by the plodding feet of immense beasts, mammoths, mastodons, camels, bison, elk, and giant sloths that could stand on their back legs to graze the leaves off trees 20 feet high. Massive as these animals were, they had predators to match. Short-faced bears, 50% bigger than a grizzly, dire wolves, and saber-toothed cats prowled through the long grass. No doubt these predators climbed the hills and studied their prey passing below. Human hunters, too, used the hills to spot their prey, clutching their spears, their eyes following the long marching lines of animals and listening to their bellowing and trumpeting. But then the world's climate changed. Glaciers melted in the Sierras and around the world. Sea level began to rise as much as an inch a year. The shoreline moved a mile or more in a man's lifetime. The sea drowned the vast river delta, then spread across the coastal plains. It crept in through the Golden Gate and flooded the entire valley, leaving only the hilltops standing as islands. About midway between Alcatraz and Point Cavallo that were a group of steep, rocky hills. One of them rose just 4 feet above the water. It was named Shag Rock for the shags or cormorants that inhabited it. It was also sometimes known as Barrel Rock, and it was definitely a hazard to navigation. Next to it was another rock just under the surface called Shag Rock number 2. On the morning of October 26, 1861, the clipper ship Winged Racer was outbound for Liverpool with 12,000 sacks of wheat. After passing Alcatraz, she turned west for the Golden Gate, but struck on the submerged Shag Rock number 2, tearing a hole in her bottom and sticking fast. She soon swung off and tied up at North Point Dock with 8 feet of water in her hold. She was repaired and returned to service, only to be captured and burned a few years later by the Confederate raiders CSS Alabama. Other wrecks on Shag Rock were the ship Torrent in 63, the bark Lennox in 65, and the bark Emily in 1883. In 1893, the Sausalito News complained, quote, "It occurs to us the press of California could not engage in a more deserving cause than to call the attention of Congress and the powers that be to the death traps which lurk about the entrance of San Francisco. If our magnificent harbor were on the Atlantic side of the continent, such perils in the road of commerce as Arch and Shag Rock would be blown out by the federal government," unquote. In 1899, Congress appropriated funds to remove Shag Rocks. The contract was let to the lowest bidder, the Coast Contracting Company of Los Angeles, Rudolph Axman, president. There would be no massive explosion as at Blossom Rock. Shag Rock would be taken down gradually. They began by erecting a 100-foot mast on the rock, supported by a ring of guy wires. With a crane attached to the mast, workers then built a wooden scaffolding around Shag Rock. They installed 4 massive steam drills to bore scores of holes 50 feet into the rock. Divers would then fill the holes with explosives. The heavy seas, fog, and tidal currents, reaching 8 knots at times, meant that the divers could work only a few hours each day. It was dangerous work, and only the bravest men had the courage to work in such conditions. Yet a young woman had the courage to brave the depths. She was 24-year-old Nellie Ernestine Cochran, born in Mariposa in 1876. She became a newspaper reporter for the San Francisco Call, writing under the pen name of Nan Bixby. Her editor sent her out on a tugboat to do a story on the progress of the work. She managed to talk the president of the company into letting her dive. She was put into the diving suit and weighted with 300 pounds of lead. Then she climbed down the ladder into the sea. She went down 41 feet and reported her impressions vividly. Quote, "There was a sound of gurgling air and some bubbles in front of the little windows in the helmet, then a ringing in my ears that grew deafening, but not much feeling of fear. There was plenty of room, plenty of air, and the little windows might have been glazed glass if I hadn't known it, instead of plain glass with the San Francisco Bay all around. Altogether, the big suit was quite snug and cozy, and it was hard to realize that I was underwater. Just at first, when the ringing in my ears began, there was that feeling that one experiences when one dreams of falling. And again, upon touching the bottom, it was light, like the way one drops to the ground in a dream," unquote. On April 30th, 1900, the big day arrived. As the San Francisco Call described it the next day, "In the twinkling of an eye, a huge mass of rock and water and splintered lumber from the derrick that had been erected to facilitate operations were flying heavenward. Long before the water had ceased mounting upward, the rock was falling back into the water, and the splash, splash, splash of the huge pieces could be heard a mile away. After the great upheaval has subsided somewhat, the water over the spot once marked by Shag Rock continued to boil for nearly 15 minutes, unquote. The contractor used a dredger to clear the rubble off the pile. In July 1900, a government survey certified the rock as cleared to 37 feet deep. The contractor moved right on to drilling the submerged Shag Rock number 2 nearby, using the big dredger Golden Gate as a work platform. On August 25th, the schooner Lizzie Preen left San Francisco, bound to Oregon. She tacked towards the Marin shore, but the ebb tide carried her down onto the massive dredger. The schooner received a hole in her bow, but was able to put back to the Spear Street wharf for repairs. The bargemen and divers drilled a series of holes into the rock and blew it up on September 5th, 1900. The Call described the spectacle. "The water about the rock seemed to gather itself into an immense mound, which rose slowly, flashing with 1,000 hues where the sun caught it, until it towered above the bay, 1,500 feet high, a solid white column of water, looking like a slender iceberg. At the top, the wind caught the graceful shaft and turned the summit into feathery plumes. For some seconds, the shaft remained, to all appearance, solid as marble and towering like a monument over the shattered rock. Then, slowly, it sank, until the troubled bubbling of the waves was all that remained to tell of the destruction of a historic obstruction to navigation. All the launches and small boats dashed in, and from the water, now a dark brown color, gathered a great harvest of fish," unquote. Arch Rock was one of the most prominent landmarks of San Francisco Bay. Rising out of deep water right in the middle of the channel, it was the first object seen by ships entering the bay. It was a steep-sided rock, 26 feet high and about the same in diameter, the top of a 100-foot crag rising from the floor of the bay. Constantly covered with birds and streaked white with their guano, it was often called Bird Rock on the old charts. A cave, 12 by 15 feet, pierced completely through the rock from north to south, giving it its most common name. At low water, it was possible to row a small boat through the arch, but the narrowness of the opening and the constant waves made it a very risky adventure. Arch Rock lay directly on the route of the ferries running between the city and Sausalito or Tiburon. Passengers loved its romantic and picturesque appearance, with waves pounding against its black sides and flocks of seabirds constantly wheeling about its crag. The captains of the ferries were not so enamored of it. At night or in the frequent fogs, it was a major hazard to navigation and a constant danger. The first documented wreck was that of the ship Flying Dragon. She loaded 1,000 tons of coal in Newcastle, New South Wales. After a fast passage of 55 days, she entered the Golden Gate on January 29th, 1862. The winds were light, but at 10 o'clock, a squall from the southeast struck her. The sails were clewed up and the ship brought to an anchor, but before sufficient chain could be got out to hold her, she had dragged down to and struck on Arch Rock. The flood tide kept the ship hard up against the rock. The pumps were manned and guns were fired and signal lights burned. Boats came out from Alcatraz with soldiers to assist at the pumping, but the ship kept settling lower in the water. At 8 o'clock the next morning, she was slewed around to the east of the ledge, arch rock over her stern, her prow pointing toward Alcatraz. At 10, she fell over on her starboard side and nothing below the topgallant yards was visible. She was a total wreck. Captain Watson and his men had time to save their valuables and clothing. 6 years later, in 1868, another coal ship came to grief on the rock. The ship Autocrat, 153 days from Baltimore, entered the bay and was becalmed. A strong flood tide was running at the time. As soon as Arch Rock was seen, the anchor was hove out, but before it brought the vessel up, she struck heavily and went broadside on the rock. All efforts to get her off proved futile. The captain, his family, and all hands left the vessel. The ship lay partially submerged for several weeks, allowing salvors the chance to save the sails and rigging and the crew's effects. Divers recovered part of her cargo, but on the 23rd, her bottom gave way and the remaining coal slid out into deep water. 3 more vessels struck Arch Rock, but all were pulled off with only minor damage. Arch Rock's only usefulness now was as a target for the big guns at the Presidio. Apparently, the Army didn't think to warn mariners they were firing into the strait, even when there were vessels in the vicinity. In 1884, the bark J.D. Peters was entering the bay when a shell passed between her masts, cutting some of her rigging. The shell struck the water very close to the pilot boat America, just beyond her. 4 years later, a big 12-inch shell fired from Fort Winfield Scott carried away the jib gear of the schooner Archie and Fonte when that vessel was putting to sea. The shot struck just a few feet above her decks. If it had hit her hull, she would have been blown out of the water. In 1897, the bark Ceylon arrived from Honolulu with a load of sugar for the Spreckles Company. The wind died and the strong flood tide carried her straight toward Arch Rock. The quarantine steamer George M. Sternberg saw her predicament and rushed to her aid. The steamer got a line aboard and did her best to tow the bark out of danger, but she still struck heavily and careened over, her masts and yards touching the water across the steamer. Immediately, the surface of the water was covered with floating pieces of wood, but it proved to be only her outer sheathing. The Sternberg towed her off to a dock and she was repaired. The maritime community had had enough. They successfully pressured Congress to authorize and fund a project to remove Arch Rock to a depth of 40 feet. In 1899, the job was assigned to the Coast Contracting Company of Los Angeles, who had just removed Shag Rocks. Within a week, they had erected stages surrounding the rock, frightening off the seabirds that were constantly circling the picturesque pinnacle. Large drill rigs were installed on the stages. Holes were bored into the rock and filled with explosives. On November 3rd, the first blasts were set off, blasting the entire upper section of the island 150 feet into the air. In May 1901, a severe gale destroyed much of the platform and it had to be rebuilt. Divers recovered the tools and drills and work was resumed. Finally, on August 15th, 1901, all was ready. 260 holes had been bored and filled with 30 tons of explosives. The wires were led to a barge 4,000 feet away and the button was pressed. The call described it this way: with a low rumble and a sharp subsequent explosion, this landmark of the Northern Bay flew helter-skelter into space. Timbers, rock, and seawater beat into a foam, spread for a half mile around the one-time jutting rock. A small-sized tidal wave was kicked up. Then all the disturbing elements subsided, and what was left of the danger to incoming ships had sunk beneath the troubled waters or scattered itself on the flood tide, only to be carried away by the current of the swiftly moving stream. The work was accomplished in workmanlike fashion, and the spectacle suffered in consequence. When Shag Rock was shattered to bits, the water rose like a whirling spout with a milky cloak. It took some minutes to subside and presented a sight that was full of beauty. There was none of this yesterday. Broad of base and comparatively low in height, the cloud of water that was raised made a speedy ascent and almost as quick a descent. It was a momentary duration and was over with before the spectators on shore and in boats realized just what had taken place, unquote. But the work was far from done. Contractor Axman had hoped to be able to remove the shattered rock with dredges, but some of the pieces weighed more than 15 tons and had to be drilled by divers and blown up into manageable pieces. They worked through the end of 1901 and all of 1902. By February of 1903, the rubble had all been dumped into deep water, but there was still one remaining pinnacle above the specified depth. Divers went down and drilled it full of holes for one final blast. But just as they triggered the explosion, an unmanned dynamite barge drifted over the site and it was blown to splinters. It wasn't until May 1903 that the Corps of Engineers confirmed that the rock was cleared to 32 feet and the contract was fulfilled. Just 200 yards off the tip of San Quentin Point, there used to be a small rocky island of 1.5 acres called Agnes Island. It was part of Rancho Punta de Quintin, a Mexican rancho that extended from Point San Quentin to San Anselmo. In 1840, Juan Bautista Alvarado, governor of Alta California, granted the rancho to John Rogers Cooper, who had arrived in California in his own sailing schooner in 1823. In 1850, the rancho was bought by Benjamin Buckalew, who with his wife Martha had come to California in 1846 in one of the earliest wagon trains to cross the Sierra. They decided San Rafael needed a ferry to connect with San Francisco and chose Agnes Island for the terminal. They built a 350-foot dirt causeway out to Agnes Island, graded a road around the north side, and built a wharf to serve as a terminal for their small ferries. In 1869, the first railroad was established in Marin, the San Rafael and San Quentin Railroad, running from the downtown railroad station to the ferry terminal on Agnes Island. They also operated the ferry line to San Francisco. In 1875, the railroad was taken over by the North Pacific Coast Railroad. In 1884, the Corte Madera Railroad Tunnel was built, drawing all cross-bay traffic to Tiburon or Sausalito, and the San Quentin terminal was closed down. But in 1915, with the growth of automobile traffic, Marin motorists wanted a faster way to get to the East Bay. The Richmond San Rafael Ferry Company opened an auto ferry line across the bay to Richmond with 4 ferries. This line flourished until 1956, when the Richmond San Rafael Bridge was opened. Bridge construction built directly over Agnes Island, ending its long and interesting history. This submerged rock is the highest projection of a larger reef called Presidio Shoal. It lies about 150 yards offshore of Crissy Field, just off the entrance of the restored lagoon. The American bark Anita was operating on the coast of California at least as early as 1847. The following year, she was bought by the American government as a transport vessel. She served in the war against Mexico in 1848. I couldn't find the details, but at some point she must have struck the rock and gave it her name. The hidden rock was buoyed from 1870 to today, but accidents continued to occur. All managed to get off with various amounts of damage. In 1903, the buoy was replaced by a buoy lighted by a flashing gas jet. In 1913, preparations were underway for the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a 10-month celebration of the opening of the Panama Canal. It was to be a monumental event, like a World's Fair. The entire waterfront of the Marina District was to be converted into a series of gardens, towers, fountains, and beautiful exhibition halls, one from every state and from many countries. The whole would be lit with thousands of electric lights. A ferry terminal was constructed at the fairgrounds so people could easily visit from anywhere on the bay. It promised to be a spectacular event. The Bay Area saw it as a chance to show the world that they had recovered from the 1906 earthquake and fire. There was immense excitement and curiosity about the upcoming gala. Monday, March 29th, 1915, was designated as Solano County Day at the exposition, and various events, demonstrations, and exhibits celebrating that county were planned. A small steam ferry, the General Frisbee, was chartered to bring a delegation of Solano County residents to the fair from Vallejo. Among the 175 passengers was a group of 75 orphans from the Good Templars home in Vallejo. The ferry delivered its passengers to the ferry terminal at the fairgrounds, and they spent a pleasant and exciting day enjoying the exposition. When the sun went down after a long day of activities, the exposition turned on its thousands of brilliant lights, lighting the entire shoreline and turning the adjacent waters nearly as bright as day. It was the early days of electric lighting, and people were not used to such sights. The children toured the zone with its many rides and concessions, then marched happily aboard the steamer at 9 o'clock. They were excited, tired, and hungry. Many went straight to the ferry's dining room for a late dinner. The ferry backed out of the terminal just after 9:30. Captain Henry Potvin decided to give the orphans a good last look at the illuminated exposition and turned west to run along the entire length of the fairground. Keeping 100 yards offshore and running at half speed, the passengers had a perfect view of the sparkling lights, white buildings, and the great searchlight sweeping the sky. The lights made it easy for Captain Potvin to see the Presidio shoal buoy, which he stayed well clear of. But just as they passed the Illinois exhibit building, there was a heavy shock, throwing most of the passengers from their feet. The sound of splintering planks was so loud it was easily heard from the shore. The crowd strolling the promenade along the shore turned to stare in amazement as the ferry crashed to a stop. The rock tore a hole in her side and she listed heavily to port, dipping her port rail into the sea. The passengers rushed to the starboard side. The children shrieked with fright. Accounts vary as to how the passengers behaved, from, quote, "A panic immediately ensued in which the crew found great difficulty in keeping the children from jumping overboard," unquote, to, "The striking feature of the accident is the admirable coolness of the 75 orphans. Obeying the orders of the officers implicitly, they set an example of coolness for the 100 men and women also aboard." Captain Potvin ordered the steamer's whistle sounded to attract aid, and the deafening shriek of the whistle drowned out the cries of the passengers. The signal was heard, and the huge searchlights on the roof of the exhibition halls were trained on the stranded steamer. The battleship Oregon was anchored nearby. Seeing the accident, she launched 2 steam launches and a sailing launch. The Frisbee partially righted herself, and order was quickly restored when both the children and their elders realized there was no immediate danger. The sea was as smooth as plate glass, the shore only a stone's throw away, and the battery of searchlights at the exposition's marina showed the passengers the rapid approach of the rescue boats. The Frisbee immediately launched its own lifeboats, each carrying as many of the women as would fit. The Oregon's boats took off the rest of the women and the children. Lifesavers from Fort Point and Point Bonita launched their motor lifeboats, taking off the rest of the passengers. Soldiers from the Presidio and firemen waded waist deep out into the water to meet the boats and carried the orphans to the beach and then to the Idaho building. The passengers were given dry clothing, hot coffee, and refreshments. They spent the night in the Idaho building, and early the next morning, another ferry took them home to Vallejo. The next day, a tugboat managed to pull the Frisbee free. She was found to have lost 75 feet of her keel. She was repaired and eventually returned to service. 6 more vessels struck the rock over the next 15 years. The most embarrassing was when the pilot boat, California, went aground on a calm day in 1941 with 6 licensed California bar pilots aboard. One said, "I haven't the faintest idea how she got there." There were more incidents after the war, but surprisingly, the Coast Guard decided the rock was no longer a danger and removed the buoy in June 1956. More small vessels started hitting the rock, and 2 months later, a new buoy was installed with a submarine power cable from shore to operate a light and fog signal. Even then, the Liberian freighter Suan ran aground on Anita Rock in 1967. Anita Rock is still down there. In the early days of its history, San Francisco's primary anchorage was Mission Bay, a large, shallow, open bay that has since been filled in. Here is an 1859 chart overlaid on Google Earth. Mission Bay ran from Brannan Street south all the way to Cesar Chavez Street and extended inland as far as Potrero Avenue. Just off the mouth of the bay was a shoal of 14 acres, surmounted by a rocky island of about 1/7 of an acre, called variously Mission Rock, Mission Bay Rock, and Mission Island. The island and shoals protected Mission Bay from easterly winds and swells, but they were a danger to ships entering in the dark or fog. In 1866, a man named Frank Swift assumed possession of it, built a house, and started advertising his fish chowder and the excellent fishing to be had from the rock. The state granted him the island and 160 acres of shoals and rocks around it. It passed through several hands and over the years. By 1876, the owners had driven pilings in the water around the island and built 8.5 acres of wharves. Then they built a huge 2.5-acre warehouse for storing 40,000 tons of grain before shipment. The island became a busy shipping terminal. In 1890, John Spreckles leased the warehouse for his sugar warehouse. Numerous ships struck the rock over the years, but no serious incidents occurred. The island was sometimes used for quarantining infected passengers and ships. In 1900, it was planned to use it to house Chinese victims of a serious outbreak of bubonic plague, but they refused to go. There were various plans over the years to build a causeway to connect the island to the shore. Nothing came of these schemes until 1946, when Pier 50 was extended all the way out to Mission Rock in a $4.5 million project. Mission Rock is still down there under the concrete of Pier 50, where roll-on, roll-off ships dock to unload wheeled cargo. It's just a quarter mile from McCovey Cove. Rincon Rock was a submerged rock just 100 yards off Rincon Point on the east shore of the city of San Francisco. It was 100 feet long by 20 feet wide and was covered by 7 feet of water at low tide. The shore south of Rincon Point was a favored anchorage from the earliest days of the port. Rincon Hill, just to the west, provided shelter from the prevailing westerly winds, and the point protected the area from the worst of the swells. The bottom provided good holding for anchoring even the largest ships, so the Navy favored the anchorage for its big warships. For this reason, the anchorage was sometimes called Man-of-War Row. From the earliest days, the submerged reef was a hazard. Although it was buoyed, this was little help in the dark or fog, and there were a number of groundings there. During the Civil War, Confederate warships roamed the Pacific, sinking any Union ships they encountered. The Union Navy ordered the construction of an ironclad monitor to protect the West Coast. The USS Comanche was built in New Jersey, then disassembled and shipped around the Horn on the ship Aquila. After a long passage, the Aquila arrived in San Francisco on November 10th, 1863. She tied up to the wharf at Rincon Point to celebrations by the maritime community and the general public. But before her precious cargo could be unloaded, a severe storm with high winds battered the bay for more than 24 hours. Nearby was the British ship Isca, loading a cargo of grain for Australia at the Market Street Wharf. The storm winds tore her away from the wharf, and she was swept out onto Rincon Point, dragging a long section of the dock with her. As she swept past the Aquila, she carried away the Americans' bow lines. The Aquila was swinging freely, crashing against the dock and sustaining damage. With a 750-ton monitor aboard, the Aquila was so heavy that she could not rise with the waves, and they swept across her decks, carrying away anything movable. She began pounding on the bottom. During the night, her planking opened up, and she sank at the dock. The Aquila was destroyed, but after the storm, the Navy retrieved the pieces of the Comanche from the submerged hold. She was assembled and launched a year later and finally commissioned in May 1865. But by that time, the war was over, and she never fought. Several other wrecks occurred on Rincon Rock over the ensuing decades. In 1873, the government called for bids for the rock's destruction, and the job was awarded to John N. Risdon. Risdon had been in New York in 1826 and came to San Francisco no later than 1861. He went into a partnership that built boilers for steamships and mines, and in 1868 founded the Rincon Iron and Locomotive Works, located at Beale and Howard Streets, just a few blocks from Rincon Rock. He formed a new company, the Risdon Blasting Works, and placed an advertisement for workers in the daily Alta California. Risdon proposed to drill a row of holes across the rock to a depth of 20 feet and break off the rock by blasting, either with giant powder or nitroglycerin. The rock would be removed gradually, not in one great blast as at Blossom Rock. He built a substantial wharf over the rock, 140 feet long by 110 feet wide. 4 drilling machines were at work almost constantly, drilling the hundreds of holes required. Work progressed steadily for the next 18 months. As the rock was only 100 yards offshore, it must have been a noisy and dusty annoyance for the local residents, but much worse was to come. Risdon had rented a small frame building at the corner of Stewart and Folsom Streets, near where the Cupid span sculpture stands now. Here, the giant powder, nitroglycerin, and blasting caps were stored, and Risdon had his field office. Every day, his foreman, William Clark, filled the cartridges for the next day's blasting. He always insisted on smoking his pipe as he did this. When people told him he was foolish to smoke around explosives, he laughed and said that only electricity and a blasting cap could set off the explosives. He assured them that he was perfectly safe. He was wrong. At 3 p.m. on April 7th, 1875, 18 months into the project, Clark and his assistant, George Green, were filling cartridges with giant powder when a spark from Clark's pipe dropped into a 50-pound box of powder. It did not explode. Clark was right about that, but it did catch fire. Green panicked and ran out of the building. Clark tried to put it out, but the fire spread to a box of detonating caps. They started to pop off and ignited an 8-pound cartridge he had just filled. The resulting explosion blew the little building into splinters. It also demolished a saloon and a restaurant at Spear and Harrison, a frame dwelling on Spear and another dwelling on Harrison. It crushed in the northwest corner of Hathaway's brick bonded warehouse at the foot of the wharf and set fire to a hay warehouse on the other side of Harrison and a coal storage building of the Black Diamond Coal Company. The shattered buildings all burst into flame. Pitiful cries could be heard from people trapped in the rubble. Fire engines arrived on the scene and hooked up their hoses to hydrants, but the water mains in that part of the city were much smaller than normal, and the water pressure was too low to be effective. This would be a problem again during the 1906 earthquake and fire. The firemen dipped their hoses into the bay and fought the several fires with salt water. The blast was so intense that houses blocks away on Beale Street had their paint scorched and their windows broken. Lassen Saloon, 5 blocks away at Fremont and Harrison, had every window blown out. In the end, 10 people died and a much larger number were wounded. The cost of the property damage was estimated at over $250,000, about $7 million today. Risden went ahead and completed the destruction of Rincon Rock later that year. Today, what is left of Rincon Rock serves as part of the foundation of the Bay Bridge. One of the dangers and pleasures of the kind of research I do, scanning old newspapers for items I think people will find interesting, is the unexpected side stories that occasionally turn up. This one was too bizarre to leave out. Remember Shag or Barrel Rock? The tiny 4-foot-high rock closest to the Golden Gate? This is the only picture I could find of it. Yes, that's a shag standing on top, so you can see how small it was. How could such a tiny rock have been involved in a duel, a scorned woman in a long black veil, 2 celebrated murder trials, 2 bitter disputes about county borders, and might well have determined the fates of 2 murderers? It started on the evening of Wednesday, August 18th, 1858. George Pendleton Johnston, 32, had been born in Kentucky in 1826 and served as a sheriff in Mississippi before coming to California. Here he became a U.S. Marshal, then a clerk of the U.S. Circuit Court, and finally a state legislator. He was a friend and supporter of Senator William McKendry Gwynn, 53. Who was an outspoken defender of slavery. Gwynn and John C. Fremont were California's first 2 U.S. senators. Johnston was drinking in the Bank Exchange Saloon, now the site of the Transamerica Pyramid, with some friends and fellow state legislator William Irwin Ferguson, 33. Ferguson was an attorney from Springfield, Illinois, a former partner of Abraham Lincoln, and a strong opponent of slavery. The party started out convivially enough, with jests and ripostes on both sides. But at some point, Ferguson accused Johnson of being owned by Senator Gwynn and repeated a rhyme he had heard concerning Mrs. Gwynn. Johnston took offense and demanded that he retract the slur on the lady. Ferguson refused. Johnston called Ferguson a liar. A scuffle broke out, but they were separated by their friends. Johnston pulled a gun, but put it away because Ferguson was unarmed. He then challenged Ferguson to a duel by pistol. The duel was set for 5 p.m. on the following Saturday at Angel Island. Ferguson told his friends he knew nothing about pistols and had never fired one, but was willing to accept the challenge. On Saturday, August 21st, Ferguson, his 2 seconds, 2 doctors, and some friends took the Petaluma steamer and debarked at Angel Island. Johnston arrived later in a sailboat, along with his seconds, doctors, and a number of friends. The duel was held on Quarry Point, on the eastern point of the island. Each duelist was handed a loaded pistol with a hair trigger. They stood 10 paces apart, and at a signal, both fired. Neither was struck, though a ball brushed the tails of Johnston's coat. They then closed to 5 paces apart, about 20 feet, and the signal was given again. Both men attempted to fire first, but in their hurry pulled the triggers before the pistols were fully raised. Both balls struck the ground at their opponent's feet. They mocked each other about their poor shots, then retired to talk with their friends as the pistols were reloaded. When the signal was given, Ferguson fired immediately, but missed. Everyone assumed Ferguson was a dead man. Johnston then took careful aim and pulled the trigger. Ferguson staggered backwards, and his doctor rushed forward to catch him before he fell. but the ball had only passed through his beard without striking him. They took aim a fourth time and both fired simultaneously. Ferguson's ball shot off Johnston's trousers button and grazed his wrist, but Johnston's ball struck Ferguson in the thigh, causing a major wound. Both men inquired after the other's wounds, then shook hands. Johnston said, "Uncle Fergie, I'm dreadfully sorry for you, and I am perfectly satisfied." Ferguson replied, "Oh, that's all right." The parties returned to the city and had their wounds treated. Johnston's was only the loss of a bit of skin, but Ferguson's femur was shattered. He was in considerable pain even after the ball was removed. His doctor finally said his leg would have to come off. Ferguson hoped to be able to save his leg and refused. The wound became infected, and he died after 25 days of agony. Johnston was arrested in his home in San Francisco for murder. And this is where lonely Shag Rock finally enters the picture. In which county had the murder occurred, and therefore had the jurisdiction to try the case? General Mariano Vallejo had defined the boundaries of the counties in 1850. In that original document, the northern boundary of San Francisco County was defined as, quote, beginning at low water mark on the north side of the entrance to the Bay of San Francisco and following the line of low water mark along the northern and interior coast of said bay to a point northwest of Golden Rock. Thence, due southeast to a point within 3 miles of high water mark of Contra Costa County, unquote. This was relatively clear enough, except that nobody had ever heard of any place called Golden Rock. A number of witnesses were questioned to identify the place. The consensus was that Golden Rock was Shag Rock. This put all of Angel Island clearly in Marin County. Johnston was indicted by a Marin County grand jury. Many people in San Francisco thought Johnston should hang. After all, he was the man who had passed the law making dueling illegal in California, and he should be made an example. But Marin County jurors saw it differently. Johnston's attorney, Alexander Parker Crittenden, known as AP, and another staunch pro-slavery man, argued that his client could not have murdered Ferguson because Ferguson was not killed in the duel. His death was entirely due to his stubborn refusal to follow his doctor's advice. Rather remarkably, the Marin jury agreed, and Johnston was acquitted. The Daily Alta California grumbled, "The verdict constitutes a farcical termination to a bloody tragedy." As a curious aside, modern maps show that Angel Island is indeed in Marin County, all except for a tiny sliver on the far eastern side, Quarry Point, where the shooting took place. So the duel actually happened in San Francisco County after all. It's very possible, given the sentiments of the day, that Johnston would have been hanged had he been tried there. Oddly enough, the whole question of Shag Rock and the county line came up again 12 years later. On November 3rd, 1870, A.P. Crittenden, the defense attorney who had pulled off the remarkable saving of his client, saved Johnston from the hangman, took the ferry El Capitan from San Francisco to Oakland. He and his 22-year-old son, Parker, were going to meet Mrs. Crittenden and their 10-year-old daughter, who were returning from a long stay in the East. The ferry docked at the 2-mile-long Oakland Long Wharf, the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. The family was reunited and boarded the ferry to return to San Francisco. The ferry cast off and backed away from the pier. Suddenly, a woman with her face hidden behind a black veil came up to them and stopped in front of AP, where he sat between his wife and daughter. "You've ruined me and my daughter," she exclaimed, then pulled a pistol and shot him in the chest. AP slumped over onto his wife's lap, and the woman rushed off and disappeared into the crowd. Parker Crittenden soon spotted her and pointed her out to the ferry's officers. "There she is," he said. "That's the woman who shot my father, and I charge her with murder." She replied, "Well, I haven't said I didn't. I did shoot him, and I meant to kill him." She was taken into custody. The El Capitan hurried back to the city, and Crittenden was taken to his home, where he died the next day. The veiled woman proved to be Mrs. Laura Fair, yet another die-hard secessionist who had formerly run the Tahoe House, a hotel in Virginia City, Nevada. She had been married several times and widowed thrice. One husband had committed suicide. Allegedly, she had shot a man when he tried to raise a Union flag over her hotel. It came out that she and Crittenden had been lovers for 7 years already, and that Crittenden had promised her he would leave his wife for her. Apparently, she got tired of waiting. And here is where Shag Rock again enters this sordid story. The San Francisco and Alameda County line ran very close to the ferry's position at the time of the murder, and both claimed jurisdiction to try Laura Fair. But in which county did the murder really occur? The newspapers turned back to the Johnston trial and again brought up the theory that Shag Rock marked the San Francisco County line. When that line was projected southeast, as stated in the definition of the county, it would not only put Alcatraz and Yerba Buena Islands in Alameda County, but also part of the northeastern section of the city. Residents of San Francisco were outraged. Finally, the Daily Alta California resolved the question. During 20 years, Red Rock has been known to the surveyors of San Francisco County and the surveyors of Marin, Contra Costa, and Alameda counties as Golden Rock. So the county line ran through Red Rock and had nothing to do with Shag Rock. Here are the actual county lines. Once this was settled, Laura Fair was indicted for murder in San Francisco. Her case was a sensational one, full of strange characters, numerous lovers, and salacious activity. She was painted as a seductress. She tried a defense of temporary insanity, claiming that an extremely painful menstrual cycle had affected her reason. But she was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. Then the burgeoning feminist movement came to her assistance. Both Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton visited her in prison. Her case was appealed, backed by Emily Pitt Stevens, founder of the California Women's Suffrage Association. The judgment was overturned on the basis of prejudice, and Laura Fair was retried and this time acquitted. She died in 1918, aged 82. So tiny Shag Rock, only 4 feet high, figured prominently in the newspapers for decades and may well have helped determine the fates of 2 killers. So that's the story of the Lost Islands of San Francisco Bay. This bay area is packed full of history on the land, on the water, and even beneath the waves. Yeah. Next time you cross the bay, think of these lost islands still down there beneath the waves. That's it. Thank you.
Brian, you never disappoint.
Thank you. Isn't that a wild story?
Yeah, a really, really good talk. Thank you so much. So much research, wonderful images, incredible maps, all kinds of details. Thank you so much. I am going to hold up this book for people to see. This is his most recent publication, The Lost Islands of San Francisco Bay. How can people get this book, Brian?
It's on Amazon. It's also at Bay Books in Sausalito, the bookstore in San Anselmo that I've now forgotten the name of, Sugarfoot, and at Fairfax Variety. It's in the libraries. So hopefully you can find it, but Amazon is the easiest way.
Okay, great. And your other books, how can they?
That's the same.
Same. Okay. So before I go take a look to see if we have any questions, I have a couple of questions for you.
All right.
Miss Nellie, the reporter.
Yeah.
So what happened after she went in, no one else would. What was her life like after that experience?
She continued to do some very adventurous reporting. She covered war zones. She was, involved in combat. She wrote very interesting articles. I didn't pursue her in great detail, but I keep stumbling on these, plucky girl reporters from this era. It was quite common for the newspapers to have at least one woman reporter on the staff, and they'd send them into unusual or, scary situations, and people would thrill at the adventures of these young women. One of them spent the night in the haunted cell in the San Rafael jail. She later covered the Spanish-American War. She went and interviewed the Filipino rebel general during the combat. It was just amazing. So they had careers. They were respected journalists. Almost forgotten today. There's probably another book there somewhere about these girl reporters, they called them.
Yeah, it was very impressive young woman. And the other question I have is Red Rock to the right as you're heading towards the East Bay on the San Rafael Richmond Bridge. So you can see Red Rock to the right.
Yeah.
I heard it was once for sale.
Yes. Last I heard, it still was. I haven't kept up on it. It's gone through many hands. It was mined for a while. I think I'm not sure, but there's a mine shaft on the west side of it that you can still get into. And the view from the top is great. It's really an interesting rock to get on. A lot of poison oak.
You mean anybody can just go to it?
Yes, if you don't tell anybody.
How about the island where the lighthouse the hotel is on the left side of the bridge?
Yeah, that's on East Brother Island, and then there's West Brother Island right next to it. It's a bird sanctuary. And then there were two very small islands on the other side called the Sisters. So the sisters and the brothers, and you went right between them to go up to the Sacramento River to Vallejo.
Oh, how much is the island for sale, or was it for sale for?
That I don't know. See your realtor.
Okay, so thank you for that lovely talk. Let's see, we've got a question here. This is from Hugh. Is the buoy in the photo behind you over one of the missing islands?
Well, it's not very far from Shag Rock. This is that's a Yellow Bluff. That's yeah. I was racing there. I was out on the bow, mostly underwater, trying to go around that buoy, and a news boat came by and snapped the picture. But yeah, that's Yellow Bluff. So it was probably a half a mile from Shag Rock. But another one of these islands that it was far enough down it didn't have to be blown up, was Harding Rock. And there's a buoy on that. And that was a very popular rounding buoy for racing. So I heard the names of some of these islands long before I knew anything about them.
We've got a comment by Vicky who says Books in the Bay in Sausalito.
That's the name, yes.
Yes, that's the name. Okay, any other questions, anyone? Now is your chance. Not seeing any. Any other surprises that you came across in the writing of this book and in your research?
Well, certainly the story of these duels and murders was a great surprise. I never expected this tiny rock to be involved in all this. And it was kind of like, do I put this in the book? It doesn't really have to do with the island. Yeah, I got to put this in the book. But the scale of the engineering just astounded me. They were doing this, in 1870. They were drilling mines underwater. These were brave and clever people that were doing this.
And also wanted to comment about the public attention to these with Blossom Rock. I mean, every attempt, there was people lined up along shore waiting to see again and again. Huge
crowds. People lined up on buildings and rooftops and hilltops and along the beaches and boats all over the bay. It was, it was a big event. Everybody paid attention.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you so much. We've got another comment here. Thanks for the program. Fascinating history. When Brian Crawford comes, it's always fascinating history. So I will start to close up. We haven't any other questions, but I do have a couple of things to say to our audience. For those of you who have enjoyed our weekly email history vignettes composed by local historian, the late Chuck Olenberg, we're pleased to announce that the vignettes have been bound into more vignettes were bound into a new book called Mill Valley History Vignettes, Volume 2. It's a compilation of 152 of Chuck's most recent vignettes. Volume 2 makes a wonderful companion to Chuck's original book, Mill Valley History Vignettes. He also has a book about homestead vignettes, and all these are available in our Mill Valley Historical Society bookstore. Also available in our bookstore is Adventures of Two Coast Miwok Children, written by my dear friend and fellow board member, Betty Girk. This beautiful book brings alive Marin County's Coast Miwok legacy as it explores the daily lives of a real boy and girl who lived in neighboring villages on San Francisco Bay in the late 1700s. The little boy in this story is named Tweek Musa, but he would grow up to be known as Chief Marin, Marin County's namesake. This is a precious and beautiful book and a great gift for children and adults. So that about wraps it up. Thanks again to Brian for his wonderful presentation, and to Natalie for her technical support, and to all of you in the audience for your interest and your patronage. Please join us next month, that's August 2nd, for our next talk titled Marin County's Poor Farm and Cemetery with Ranger Mike Warner. Until then, be well and good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks, Brian.
Yep.
Thanks, Natalie.